Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast bringing guests together to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. From entrepreneurs to vendors, higher education to corporate leaders, we'll uncover their perspective regarding the latest trends and technologies impacting your career or business. Our podcast is made possible by Downing EdTech Consulting, where people and technology connect. Hosted by Cher Downing, an experienced executive spanning a higher education and corporate career with specific focus on the EdTech industry. Dr. Downing is also an international and national presenter, author, and regular media contributor. Now here is your host, EdTech strategist, Dr. Cher Downing.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast where we bring guests to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. Our goal, as you know, is to always provide you with options that are available to see products, services, and give you knowledge that can help you benefit you or your business. I'm Cher Downing, your host, and I want to introduce today's guest, Frederik Hendriksen. Welcome, Frederik.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Frederik is with Rensair, and he and I were just starting before the podcast here about the fact that my listeners can probably tell I have a little bit of a scratchy throat this week, and we were discussing the horrors of pollen and allergy season that is upon us now and getting started here in the desert, and that will eventually reach the rest of you if it ever warms up later this spring. But I'm so excited to have Frederik on here today to talk about Rensair, because I think this is something that we all struggle with and has gotten worse over the years with the addition of plants, with pollution, products that we use, all the things that we turn back into our air system. So I'm going to let you start out by giving us a little bit of a history of Rensair, because I know that this started with your dad. And tell us a little more about how you got to where it's at today.
No, absolutely, and thanks again for having me. So Rens means clean in Danish, so it's clean air. I'm from Denmark, and that's essentially the explanation for the name. But you're saying you're in the warm weather in Arizona. I'm in New York City right now, where spring hasn't made it here yet. It's still pretty cold. But a bit of background about the business. So we are such a second-generation family business. So my father's a ventilation engineer, and back around 20 years ago, he developed a solution for Scandinavian hospitals to clean the air with a standalone device. So if you think about, your traditional air purifiers you would buy for your home, like, say a Dyson or, Molecule is a big brand today, etc. Our technology has really been developed to sit in operating rooms, intensive care units, in hospitals. So the settings where you need surgically clean air, extremely clean air, and add to the HVAC solution, so the ventilation system that's already in place to clean the air there. And he was providing this equipment to healthcare broadly, also some educational facilities, but also, for instance, senior living, where a lot of people are immunocompromised and need clean air. He was doing that for many years, and then eventually retired. And the thing was, the technology was as such sitting idle. And I grew up, I spent a career in financial services in London, and then also worked for various different startups. And then when the pandemic started around 3 years ago, my twin brother and I, we run the business together today. He's based in London and I'm in New York. We talked about now must be a time, for looking at this space, because with the pandemic, there was a fundamental shift in people's understanding of air quality. A stat that's often mentioned in our industry, but I think a lot of people are still unaware of, is that we spend 90% of our time inside, and air quality inside is 2 to 5 times worse than outside. So, oftentimes when you hear about air quality, it's often pollution that's being discussed, and it's outside pollution, but really the pollution and air quality we have inside the buildings we spend all our time is much, much worse. And that is really what we started the business to set out to address. So fast forward to today, we do a lot of work within healthcare. We've delivered our solutions to more than 40 countries. So in the United Kingdom, for instance, the National Health Service, so the public healthcare system there, they are our single biggest customer, where more than 55 hospitals have our devices. We also work with some large hospitals here in the United States, like, for instance, Montefiore here in New York City, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and others. And that has been one vertical. And then what we have since then done is we have delivered our solutions to a lot of corporate offices as well. During the pandemic, a lot of businesses were realizing that actually we are not ventilating adequately to ensure that our employees and staff don't get sick while they come to work. So we need to address that, and they used our devices to do this. And then we've done a lot of work within education, which obviously, given the things here, I would love to talk some more about, because what we have also developed too as a business now is we have gone from this original focus of, say, indoor air quality and cleaning air to actually rethink how you are ventilating buildings. And we have a new solution now that we call smart demand control ventilation that we are installing with a number of large universities now, where we have shown that we can not only impact air quality positively, we can also significantly reduce the energy that is used to ventilate those buildings. So we can help spaces become more sustainable. We can help universities reach carbon reduction goals while they also provide a better learning environment for their students. And I mentioned universities specifically over, say K through 12, etc., because what is required for this solution to really achieve energy efficiencies is a central ventilation system, so mechanical ventilation, which often isn't in place in, you could say, lower grade schools, but at university level definitely is. But that being said, air quality has obviously during the pandemic been a very big focus in schools, particularly as well. One, because you don't want your children to get sick, and that has really been a hotbed, right? Like, you gather a lot of children in a classroom, but also there's a lot of data that has come out during the pandemic. For instance, there was a large study from Harvard University that showed a direct correlation between cognitive function and ability and air quality. So as soon as air quality worsens in a space you're in, you start performing worse. And that shows up in test scores. The Lancet, the research publication, they have an epidemic task force. They published a big paper citing, I believe, around 20 different studies showing how air quality affects children, their learning ability, and their performance in test scores, which is quite fascinating.
So I think that's interesting, because that is likely the whole reason why we originally, a long time ago when education first began, to have that break we call recess. We would take the children outside to get some fresh air and to get them motivated to bring them back in the classroom, because they were uninterested. They were losing, they were falling asleep. They were losing interest in what was going on. And I suspect that was probably part of it. We probably just didn't realize it at that time. And it's interesting when you talk about the ventilation systems and all of the different ways that buildings are put together, both in design and also in based on the age of the building and when they were actually, originally put together. We're seeing now a lot of buildings are being retrofitted. We're repurposing schools. People are buying whole schools to turn into homes, or old churches to turn into homes, things like that. I suspect that this issue of air quality is going to get worse every time we're doing those kinds of things, because we're probably maybe even making it worse in the sense of how the ventilation is working through those types of public buildings when we're now turning them into multifaceted usage areas.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And especially with older buildings, right? They're just not built to ventilate to a certain, to a sufficient degree that what you would expect of a modern building today. And with the school example, right? I think everyone can remember when they were, in school and sitting in a stuffy classroom with a lot of kids, and you just get tired from being there. And that's simply an effect of if you take CO2 as an example, right? What we exhale, the background level of CO2 in the atmosphere is around 400 parts per million. That's the metric. Every breath that we exhales 40,000 parts per million. So as soon as people enter a space, you will see the CO2 levels change drastically. And, in a school that, most schools are built without mechanical ventilation, so they don't have a natural flow of outside air into the space. So put 30 kids and a teacher in a room like that, close the door with no open windows. Within the hour, right, everyone's concentration is going to drop because CO2 levels become incredibly high very fast. And then, of course, you can open windows, but, depending on where you are in the country, you don't want to do that year round. So it comes with a lot of challenges. And as you then start repurposing these places, retrofitting a sufficient ventilation solution is extremely costly in the traditional ways of doing that. So no, it definitely comes with some challenges.
So talk to me a little bit about when you approach a university, and are you looking specifically at just residential in terms of their residence halls, or are you looking at also office buildings or more public spaces? I think in terms of they have theaters and arenas and those sorts of things. So really, when you're coming in to talk with a university, what are you looking at for their perspective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and also kind of goes back to some of the, you could say, science around air quality. So the very large spaces, so say like an arena, because if you have like, a sports hall or something like that, the volume of air you have in a space like that means that even if you have people that carrying respiratory diseases around or that are, exhaling CO2, whatever, the sheer volume of air in that space means that it's very hard to impact the overall air quality. So actually those places are relatively low, you could say, risk areas. And that's not where we typically focus. Also because to effectively change air quality in such a large space, you need very, very large equipment to do so. So where we focus is the office areas. It is the general lecture halls. So, lecture halls of, all the way up to a couple of hundred people. And then it's also the residential side. So we, for instance, now work with a couple of large businesses that provide student housing. So that are, linked to universities and do the student housing separately from the university. But we did a very interesting experiment here recently essentially ran a trial with University College Cork in Ireland. So one of the largest Irish universities that is also the world's fourth greenest university. So they have a very big sustainability agenda and have been very focused on that. And I think it's a good example of also how you could say thinking around air quality has changed through the pandemic. So when the pandemic started, a lot of health experts and also the WHO, the EPA here in the United States, et cetera, said, take as much outside air into your building as possible, because that lowers the risk of getting sick. And then, upgrade filters where you can. Also use portable air purification devices where you can in spaces. When you dial up the outside air intake, that is very expensive to do because you need to condition the air you're taking in. So that means you need to heat the air, you need to cool it, depending on where you are, you need to dehumidify it. And that requires a crazy amount of energy. So for University College Cork, they started going to essentially 100% outside air intake through their ventilation system. That meant that their energy bill skyrocketed and they started blowing out all their sustainability targets. They had no way of reaching those. So we met them around that time where they were saying, we need an alternative that can help us clean the air and deliver good indoor air without, spending an insane amount of money on ventilating our buildings. So we ended up equipping their lecture halls and a lot of the office spaces with some of our units where they said, okay, this is a good substitute. We can now do a rebalancing, take in slightly less outside air, and then thereby, go back to a more normal. But what we are working with them on now is our solution that we call smart demand control ventilation. That really is a solution that ventilates a space relative to the amount of people that are in the space at any given time. So it's a much more dynamic way of ventilating a space based on occupancy, but also we, with our devices, deliver an alternative clean air source that's way cheaper than the outside air that you take in and that you need to condition. So that's how we can unlock substantial amounts of energy. So we now just ran this trial with University College Cork in 2 lecture halls that each fit around 100 people. We installed 4 of our standard devices in each room, and we were then able to reduce the outside air intake in both spaces and then measure with air quality sensors. Today you can buy relatively affordable air quality sensors that will give you air quality on a number of parameters in real time. So the typical metrics that you measure is, of course, temperature, humidity, that's the basics. But then you will measure CO2 level, you will measure particulate matter. So that's where all virus, bacteria, pollen, all particulates you have floating around in the air would show up. And then you measure what's called TVOC, so total volatile organic compounds. That is various different gases. So that's stuff like, formaldehyde, ozone, that will be present in a space, but you don't want excessively high values. So we installed sensors like that in the space, and we then measure the air quality. And we then did the reduction of outside air intake. And what we've been able to show with University College Cork there is a reduction in energy consumption in that space by 38%. So a really
Wow.
substantial energy reduction, while we also improved air quality on all the parameters I mentioned when it comes to pollution, so that be primarily particulate matter and VOCs.
That's really exciting to hear. And I'm going to ask this question because I know people that are in higher education will ask this. When you put that into those lecture areas, is this something that automatically adjusts depending upon how many people come in, or is this something that they have to manually program?
So the short answer is no. So the trial we ran here now, we did it in a more, you could say, a simple way. In our fully integrated solution, our system communicates with the air handling units in the space, so they will automatically adjust. And once it's installed, you don't need to touch anything. It will just adequately ventilate. What we do typically as a step one, and when we do a trial, is we will do a one-off rebalancing of the air handling units and then dial down and then run our devices. So in no scenario does it require, continuous, you could say, involvement from the people that run the building. It's more like, you can do it in a dynamic model that would increase the savings even further than 38%. Or you could do it in this manual one-off version we did, where we were able to achieve the 38%.
Okay. And the reason I ask that is two-sided. One is it's always one extra thing for people to do. And so you've got that side of the house that says, great, now we're, adopting something else. It's going to cause us more work. But the other side of it is we have lecture halls. And what typically happens is they're never entirely full. When scheduling becomes a problem, universities are notorious for running a class of 10 people in a lecture hall that seats 100. Just because that's the only room available Wednesday at 11 a.m. So that's where they put them. But Thursday's class may have 90 people in it. And so it's a difficult situation to keep track of all of those things when it's not built into the system. So it's exciting to know that once it's integrated, then the system is looking out for you, in essence.
You're absolutely right. And the way it does that is based on the CO2 reading. So we can very accurately estimate how many people are in a space based on the change in CO2 levels and how quickly they change. So we will know, within minutes, is it, 90 people that's in the room today, or is it 10 people? And then adjust the air intake accordingly. And that, is really the big point here as well, right? Obviously, sustainability and ESG is a very large focus for many now. Some are doing it to save money. Some are doing it more for saying, we want to reduce our carbon footprint and do what's best for the planet. And either of those is, of course, a totally legitimate reason to do it. But we can help address those, essentially, the ventilation side of it. And I think a very interesting point that I also wasn't aware of until, say, about a year and a half, 2 ago, is that today, when you look at the world's total energy consumption, roughly 40% of our total energy consumption in the world is going into buildings today. So when you want to reduce carbon footprint, that's a good place to start. And inside a building, 40 to 60% of a building's total energy consumption goes towards ventilation. And I wasn't aware of that. So actually, ventilation is the main cost driver of running a building. When you look at your electricity bill every month for running a space, ventilation is one of the largest, if not the largest item. So when, for businesses that we're, for instance, doing a big project with the global insurance company AIG right now, where we are installing our solution in their offices. And they are extremely focused on reducing carbon footprint in their space. Because, again, they have an office building in London. They don't know how many people come in on any given day, right? A typical work week now is like Monday, Friday, you work from home, and then maybe you come in during the week, but it's a lot more varied. So allowing them to achieve these energy efficiencies by, bringing down that ventilation requirement. And, typically businesses or universities will look at other energy saving initiatives like, let's replace all lights with LED lights, the sort of the pretty tangible things you can do. But until recently, there hasn't really been any good alternatives for doing, you could say, for addressing the energy consumption that are used for ventilation. And that's what we do with our solution. And we have shown that, so this 40 to 60% of a building's energy consumption, we can typically reduce by around 40%. So it becomes some very substantial figures.
And that's something else that we're all dealing with right now is moving into the hybrid life, working from home a couple days a week, working in the office. But also so many of those offices, big companies, went to open office areas. So, we got rid of office buildings or walls, and instead we came in with cubicles. And so everyone's out in one area. So the difficulty there is, as you said, people are in and out. So there are days where the building's running with hardly anyone in it. So you think of the amount of stale air that's also sitting there on those days when there's not a lot of activity. But also there's a difficulty in ventilating air when it's just a big, massive room. People aren't getting a lot of quality air there. They're likely not in a place that have windows that can be open. It's really difficult to be in there and to have, productivity, but also just to maintain a level of health in there.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. And what we've been doing some work with Google as well, and what they are doing now, right? They've obviously for a long time had these open plan offices. They are very focused on air quality. But what they're doing now, because there is such a shift constantly in what is needed of the spaces they have available, they've started working with these modular meeting rooms they can set up. But that also comes with a challenge, right? Because air to a floor is typically provided in a few central spots. And when you set up a meeting room that doesn't have easy access to ventilation, it typically comes out a number of places in the ceiling. You then have the choice of putting it right above an air extract, and then you're underventilating the rest of the space, and you're pumping a ton of air into that space, and it'll probably be noisy as well. Or you place it somewhere separately, and then you have terrible air quality in there because you don't have any supply of air to that space. So modular and more modular office space and making these changes undoubtedly comes with a lot of challenges. And that's also where we find having our own modular standalone devices that we can deploy with changes to the use of a space that really matters. I was just on a call here with a state university in Kansas here just before we are speaking, and here we are looking at all their larger meeting areas for when they host events, whether it's homecoming or, alumni events and so on, how we ensure they have adequate ventilation when all of a sudden they fill, 800 people into a space that normally only fits, on any other time, maybe 100. So yeah, there's a lot of work that can be done around optimizing air quality for how you're using a space at any given time.
And I think that's so important now, because the other thing that is coming to light is, and it really kind of came from incubators for startups. People would buy a large warehouse space and then allow people to come in and work and, rent office space, rent a corner. I saw recently one that is selling space for, if you do physical products, you can't afford to have your own production warehouse or something. You can just rent a monthly space, put your kits together, whatever it is that you're doing. But again, it's more and more of these spaces are becoming larger and broader, and 3 drops in of air that it can be across, 22,000, 44,000 square feet. You're not getting a lot of air to anyone. You're not getting a lot of real clarity for anyone. But then we go the other route and we go into, say, for example, residence halls. Dorm rooms though they are getting bigger, but they're in the older buildings, they're typically small. There's multiple people in them, multiple people on a floor. So where do you see the challenges in fitting residence halls that are older versus the newer ones?
No, it's a great question, and it really depends on, for instance, with this owner of student housing that we're speaking to, they have very varied age of their building. So we're kind of going through that there. And what we are starting with is we take the buildings that have central ventilation, so a central mechanical ventilation system first, because that's where we, with our solution, can unlock energy savings. So that's where we typically start. But then even in those spaces, you have the individual rooms. And we've now developed a relatively small, extremely quiet device that can sit in some of these small dorm rooms and be placed. That is not for achieving energy savings, but it's for delivering excellent air quality in that space. And that is starting to now, we developed that as again, we came from, the hospital side. We had the larger devices that are just really meant to clean as much air as possible. You want as many air changes as possible in a space like that. Now we have a device as well that we call Compact that's really built for smaller rooms. It's ideal. I have one in my own bedroom as well, right? Like it works very well for smaller spaces. It's extremely quiet. And that's what you can deploy in these spaces as well, because obviously, in these student housing, floor space is limited. And air quality is normally also pretty terrible, because the only way you have of essentially getting some fresh air in is opening the window.
And for our healthcare listeners, you talk about working with bigger hospitals and such. Do you do any work with like smaller clinics in education? Are you doing work with, I'm thinking of the group of people that are not big business, that are a little tighter budgets, maybe a little more difficult access to things. Some of the work that you're doing in healthcare and education that's fitting into that realm.
No, it's a great question, and we have done a lot of work with smaller clinics as well. Because our devices are standalone, even in a small space, you can easily address air quality in these small spaces. And we don't have a minimum order size on any of our equipment. You can purchase one unit, and you can even do it from our website. So we have worked with a lot of clinics, also non-for-profits, that have accessed grant money to purchase our devices. But also, we get contacted by a lot of, say, doctors' offices, etc., that really only need one unit to get good coverage. We have a team, like essentially an engineering team, that will look at the floor plans of a specific space, look at the use, and then say, okay, this is what you need for this area here to get excellent coverage. We'll look at how much air is currently being delivered to the space and what would you ideally like to get to given what you are carrying out in this area. And, we do that for, whether it's large or whether it's small businesses, absolutely.
Okay, terrific. The other thing that you and I were talking about before we got started was your pilot project in the UK with where we're starting to talk about, looking at lower income areas. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's some of the work that we are very passionate about, is essentially trying to address health inequalities, because again, when you look at air quality, is often very correlated, and bad air quality is very correlated with living in lower income housing. You live closer to busy roads, the building materials you've used are typically worse. So there are a number of factors. You can have mold growth, which obviously is extremely both dangerous to be exposed to, but also causes you to develop asthma, etc. So the National Health Service in the UK, the public healthcare system, they have now funded 2 clinical trials that we have been chosen for as the provider to participate in for our air solutions, where here in the first phase here, and these trials are starting these days as we speak, for 12 months, 20 children in low-income housing with severe asthma will be provided with our units for their bedrooms, and then they will look at the development over 12 months. And there's already now essentially a follow-up study being looked at where we increase the sample size significantly to draw full conclusions. But the point is really that something like asthma, your lung capacity and your tendencies to have asthma all develops in the first 17 years of your life. So from a healthcare point of view, if you can ensure you don't develop asthma while you're a child, you're unlikely to develop it for the rest of your life. But if you have it in your first 17 years and nothing is done about it, you're going to be essentially an asthma patient for the remainder of your life. And that is what is being addressed now with this study. We are also doing another study with babies born prematurely. Again, there is a correlation between premature births and low-income housing. And oftentimes, these babies have underdeveloped lung capacity when they are born prematurely. So again, very interesting work and something that we are very proud to take part in. And we are now already speaking to a couple of university hospitals here in the United States about doing follow-on studies after the first 12 months of these to essentially develop some US data as well, which is very exciting, but I think also important work. One of the reasons why my father developed the Rensair unit originally is because my brother grew up with severe asthma and allergies, and it helped him, having one of these in his bedroom, helped him grow out of it. And, we have a ton of good stories by now of people where it's really impacted their lives. There's a family in Chicago that had conjoined twins, and they were separated, and they have now been told, that their lung capacity has developed much beyond expectation. And of course, there's 1,000 factors that plays into that. I'm not saying that Rensair did all of that, but the family has been extremely vocal about, how they've had doctors and nurses in and out of their home since the babies were born. And they, no one has gotten sick. No one has gotten COVID while that has all happened. And they believe it's in big part due to us, which obviously, that makes it worth going to work every day.
Absolutely. This has been really exciting to hear about, because I love the gambit that you look at. You look from the very smallest to the very largest. And really, it's bottom line, you're just wanting everyone to have better quality air. and be able to sleep and breathe and eat better, to feel better. You think about the oxygenation of your blood and your overall health from this. I mean, this impacts everything. As I sit here talking today in my little nasally voice, because, the allergies have attacked, it's kind of like the movies, but this is exactly it. Temperature is starting to change. The winds are picking up. All of these things are a factor, but they're a factor of every single day. I work indoors. That's a situation there. And I'm one person, but as you start to look across, and as we're now all getting back out post-pandemic, people are getting back together in groups, people are attending events and such, we're going to see more respiratory issues, not because of COVID, but because we also got very isolated for a while. So our immune systems really have kind of been on vacation for a little bit. Now they've got to reestablish themselves. And so this is such a useful tool to help with that. And when I think of, kids going off to college, they get very ill very quickly because they're suddenly in a building with several hundred other people, not eating probably as they should, out too late, all those things that occurs when you get there. This is one facet that can at least help them. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners today?
No, I think we've covered a good part. I would invite anyone who wants to learn more about what we do to go to our website. It's rensair.com. And then, overall, I appreciate the time and the opportunity to be on here. And to your point, I think if we've achieved one thing today, it's hopefully just, spread the awareness of indoor air quality and the impact it has on your health. I also, in the last couple of years, everyone goes on the subway. And of course, there was a mask mandate for a long time here in New York. That's now gone. I still wear a mask, not because I'm worried about getting COVID while I'm on the train, but because the air quality on subway stations is so terrible that, it's just with that awareness, you start being sensible. Just because it's intangible, you can't see it. It still has a massive impact on your health and your, overall cognitive function, everything else. So I think just, if people walk away with one thing today, hopefully it's that increased awareness about, what we breathe really impacts us.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for being on today, Frederik. This has been so informational, but also so exciting. For those of you out there listening that are working in healthcare and education, we will, as always, have all the contact information for Frederik on our site. Any place that you stream your podcast, you'll have that available to you as well. Until then, thank you, as always, for joining us here at EdTech Speaks, and keep learning.
Thank you for listening to EdTech Speaks with EdTech strategist Cher Downing. To learn more about the services Downing EdTech and its staff can provide you, find us at www.downingedtech.com. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it. We'd also like to hear from you regarding any suggestions for topics or guests and the value you received from our show. Check back for new podcasts with featured guests at www.downingedtech.com/podcast.